A Dog's Life, The Autobiography of a Stray, by Anne M. Martin, published by Scholastic Press. Farm Dog. I was alone again. When I set out from the baker's house that autumn, there was no bone to follow and no moon to walk with. There was no summer family, no Rachel, and no Dr. Roth. But I knew I could take care of myself. I wandered through woods and fields and along highways and around the outskirts of towns. The moon grew fat, grew small, grew fat, grew small. The crickets' voices died and fallen leaves carpeted my path. The wind became blustery and the air frosty, but no snow fell and I was able to find food. One day, when weak sunlight was filtering through the bare branches of a small forest, I smelled something familiar, something that made my hackles rise. I growled softly and stalked to the edge of the woods where I saw a group of dogs as lean as the ones at the resting place on the highway, and just as desperate. They were fighting one another over an old carcass, leathery now with no meat left on it, but they fought as if it was a fresh kill. One dog held it between his front paws and gnawed at it. When another dog ran at him, he yipped and snapped, jerking the carcass away, but dropping it as he did so. A third dog swooped in and trapped the carcass between her jaws, but the first dog bit her on the neck and she let the carcass fall. I slipped back into the forest and crept away. It was time to find a place where I could stay for the winter. I spent 2 nights sleeping behind the olive-free library. On the morning after the first night, a man saw me and set out dishes of water and kibble and tried to coax me inside, but I was wary. I ate the food the next night when the library was dark and the parking lot was empty. In the morning, I set out again. I came to a little house in the woods where a man and a woman lived with their cats. I could see the cats looking out of the windows of the house. They didn't go outside, but the woman left dishes of water and scraps on the porch. "T.G. has been hanging around again," I heard her tell the man. "I saw him twice yesterday." I didn't know who T.G. was, and I never found out. I hoped he didn't mind sharing his food with me. I spent one night at the Bearsville garage, the night of the first snow flurries of the winter. There I found good garbage and a dry doorway. I spent another night behind a big house on a hill with 3 sheds in the backyard. In front of one of the sheds, lots of logs were stacked. I slept in a niche between the logs and the shed wall. I wasn't warm, but I was dry. Early the next morning I made my way along the edge of the yard and into some woods. I had my eye on 2 fat gray squirrels that were chattering and scolding each other. The larger squirrel was chasing the smaller one around and around the trunk of a maple tree. They were paying no attention to me. I was standing motionless a little distance from the tree, one paw raised, ready to dash forward, pounce, and surprise the squirrels when, bam! I heard a noise so loud it seemed to jolt my body. The squirrels fled up the tree, jumped to the branches of another tree, and disappeared. I started to run, but since I didn't know where the noise had come from, I wasn't sure which direction to take. Then I heard voices, the voices of men. "Did you hit it?" "I don't know. I guess not. I don't see anything." "But it was right there." 2 men stepped out of the trees. They were wearing dark clothes, and each was carrying a long stick that looked like the polished branch of a tree. I remembered the man with the gun, the one who had killed mine when I was a puppy, and I took off running. "There it goes. That isn't a deer, it's a dog, I think. Anyway, it isn't a deer." I ran fast as Moon and I had run to escape the dogs at the resting place. I had gone only a short distance when I came to a large doe lying bleeding on the floor of the woods. Her eyes were open. She wasn't dead, and she turned her head slowly to look at me with glazed eyes. One leg was twitching. I slowed down, then sped up when I heard the men's voices again. I had almost reached the edge of the woods when another blast thundered through the trees. Bam! I burst out of the woods, and I found myself looking down a hill at a small farm. Next to a pond stood a white house with blue shutters. Not far away were 2 sturdy barns and a fenced-in pasture. I walked cautiously down the hill toward the pasture. Usually I tried to stay out of sight, but I was in a hurry to escape the men in the woods, and I didn't see anyone on the farm. When I reached the pasture, I jumped easily over the stone wall that bordered it and made my way to the larger of the barns. I paused at the door to listen. From inside I heard little rustlings and cooings, the noises of small rodents and birds, but nothing else. I peeked around the corner. The light inside was dim, and the dank air smelled of hay and manure and grain. Across from me were several stalls. 2 were empty. A horse stood in the third. He stamped his foot and snorted when he saw me. Maybe he wasn't used to dogs. I left the barn and investigated the pasture again. I came upon a pile of old vegetables and coffee grinds and eggshells. It wasn't exactly like the Marions' garbage heap, but it was all right. I later learned that it was called a compost heap. I walked a bit further, warily, my eyes on the barns, the house, the woods. Far off in a small rise stood 2 cows. I returned to the barn and stood in the door studying the white house. I saw a truck parked nearby. I saw that the porch was decorated with pumpkins and wreaths of dried flowers like the ones in Claremont before Christmas time. But I didn't see any people. I peered into the smaller barn. The inside looked very much like the Beckers' garage. A car was parked there, and hanging on the walls were tools and ropes and baskets. At one end was a high wooden bench with more tools laid out on it. This was not a good place to make my home, but the larger barn might be. "Hal?" I heard a woman call then. I jumped. Then I turned around and zipped back to the other barn. "Hal, telephone! Coming!" Neither of the voices sounded close by, so I peeked outside. I saw a woman who was older than Mrs. Becker, standing at the front door of the house. A man who looked about the same age as the woman was making his way slowly along a walk to the door. He was dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, and he was carrying a bucket. This was Hal, I learned, and the woman was named Jean, and they had lived on this small farm for many years. They were quiet, kind people who took good care of their animals, the horse, the cows, 4 cats, and some geese who had made their home by the pond. I made my home there too, but I didn't show myself to Hal and Jean, even though I stayed on their farm during all the days of the cold weather. I stayed while the pumpkins and the flower wreaths were taken in and ribbons and evergreen wreaths were put up in their place. I stayed through the snows, one storm so bad that Hal and Jean couldn't leave their farm for 3 days, but they fed their animals, and I dined on grain and mice until I could reach the compost heap again. I stayed while the snow melted. I stayed until I could smell spring in the air, and then I left. I spent the warm weather wandering as I had wandered after I left the Beckers' house. When the cold weather arrived, I looked for another farm, and that became the pattern of my life. Farms in the winter, wandering the rest of the time. I had lived on 4 farms, including the Andersons, and another spring had arrived when I came upon familiar odors that sent me searching for bone. The scent of bone. Springtime, and I was on the move. I had learned that humans generally make preparations for moves or trips. The Beckers had made preparations for leaving their house, but back then I hadn't recognized the signs. Now I knew what they were, boxes and packing and plans. But I never made preparations for moving on, and when it was time to go, I left. It was as simple as that. And so I had left the most recent of the farms, a large one with horses and stables and people coming and going every day, and lots of good hiding places for a dog. One morning I woke up, searched for my breakfast, and spent the day as usual. The next morning I woke up and trotted away. I was in an area called Lindenfield. I knew that from listening to people on the farm. As I loped along on that first day of traveling, I thought I smelled scents that were familiar. I couldn't quite identify them, though. They didn't say chipmunk to me, or squirrel, or male dog, or bread, the way some scents did. Still, something about them made me quicken my pace and keep my nose to the ground, snuffling as I hurried along. After a while I let the scents tell me where to go, and because I was following the scents, I found myself in areas that were busier than I liked. I walked along a road with cars and trucks whizzing by in both directions. I came to a gas station. I ran off when I heard a boy call out, "Hey, look at that dog!" I managed to cross a road, waiting first by the side until I didn't think any cars were going to speed into me. On the other side of the road I found myself in a large parking lot where the familiar smells were stronger than ever. Snuffle, snuffle. I could barely lift my nose from the ground, but when I did I saw an expanse of cars and a line of buildings with people coming and going, and some lampposts, and then a lamppost on a bit of grass and with a tree nearby. This could be only one place. It was the parking lot where Boone and I had been thrown away. I was sure of it. Odors don't lie. I was excited. I sniffed all over the lot, not caring if anyone saw me. I smelled food, and I ate the end of a hot dog bun and then some old bologna, but those weren't the smells that interested me. I was smelling time, a long time ago when my brother and I were young, and I was smelling place, the last place in which I had seen my brother. I didn't smell bone. I hadn't caught a scent, but that didn't matter. This was the closest I had felt to him since we had been separated. I sniffed around to the other side of the buildings, to the place where I had found the garbage cans. I sniffed my way back to the tree, and then to the spot where I thought George had stopped the car and tossed us out. Still no scent of bone, but the other familiar odors kept my nose going and my tail wagging, and they sent me searching for my brother. On that day, just as I had done on the day I had been separated from Bone, I hung around the parking lot. I wasn't as small as I had been then, and I didn't want to be noticed, but I was smarter about staying out of sight and about not attracting attention to myself. I waited until darkness was falling, until the parking lot had cleared of people and cars, and then I stood at the edge of the busy road and watched the cars with their lit-up eyes and listened for the whooshing. When the whooshing stopped, I ran across the road, ran back to my old woods. And here were the smells of my first winter alone. I nosed around, but I spent only one night in the woods. There was no scent of bone, so no need to stay. In the morning I set out. Although I had spent the last few summers roaming woods and fields and keeping to the edges of towns, now I carefully investigated places with human dwellings. I found streets like the side streets in Claremont, but longer and with more houses on them. During the day I watched these houses from hiding places. At night I inspected them more closely. No bone. I found a long street that reminded me of the one Marcy and George lived on, but I didn't think it was theirs. It was lined with houses, and I could tell that lots of dogs lived on this street. There were signs of dogs, leashes and bowls and toys in the yards, excrement too in some places, and scents of dogs, and I saw several dogs on runs or peeking over fences. But no bone. I wandered on and found another neighborhood. I nosed into garages. I sniffed up and down the streets at night. I even sniffed around doorways and porches if the houses were dark. No bone. I began to search houses that were farther out in the country, in the woods and hills. I explored sheds and porches. I investigated country stores. I searched while the moon changed and the days lengthened, then began to shorten. I searched until I felt a chill in the air. Some of the odors were still familiar now, but not as strongly so as the ones I had smelled at the beginning of the summer. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, didn't know how far I had walked, and I hadn't found Bone. So I moved on. It was time to find another farm for the winter, and that is exactly what I did. Winter came and went. Spring arrived, then another winter, then another spring, another winter, another spring, and finally another winter, and I had become an old dog. I was an old dog with black fur beginning to turn white, a filmy eye, bad hearing in one ear, and very achy bones in the shoulder and leg I had broken when I was young. I was weak, too, and when this newest winter arrived it was the coldest and stormiest one I could remember.